Los Angeles, 1997. Behind the palm trees and Hollywood glitter, two guitarists sat in a small rehearsal space on Sunset Boulevard. One wore the scars of rock and roll excess openly, his hands trembling slightly as they reached for a Gibson Les Paul. The other, younger by 2 decades, carried his own demons in the shadows behind his eyes. John Frusciante had just begun crawling back from the edge of oblivion. Ace Frehley had been there for years, learning to navigate the darkness. What happened between them in those secret sessions would change the sound of modern rock forever, though almost nobody knew about it until recently discovered studio notes and personal journals revealed the truth. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by untold rock history and the hidden connections between guitar legends, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. The Red Hot Chili Peppers had just fired John Frusciante in 1992, though the official story called it a departure. The reality was darker. By 1996, Frusciante was living in a Hollywood bungalow, barely alive, his arms tracked with needle marks. His weight dropped to dangerous levels. The guitarist who had played on Blood Sugar Sex Magik, one of the biggest albums of the 90s, had become a ghost haunting his own life. Friends had stopped calling. The music industry had written him off. But someone else was paying attention, someone who recognized the particular type of hell Frusciante was experiencing because he had lived it himself. Ace Frehley had left Kiss for the second time in 1996, this time on better terms, but still carrying the weight of decades of addiction and public scrutiny. Unlike his first departure in 1982, which had been explosive and bitter, this exit came with a kind of weary wisdom. Ace had learned things about survival, about maintaining your identity while fighting your demons, about the specific way guitar playing could be both therapy and torture. He had been sober for stretches, fallen back into darkness, clawed his way out again. The cycle had taught him something valuable. And when he heard about Frusciante through mutual acquaintances in the Los Angeles music scene, something in Ace recognized a younger version of himself. The initial contact came through Bob Forrest, a fixture in the LA recovery community who knew both musicians. Forrest had been trying to reach Frusciante for months, attempting to pull him back from the brink. He mentioned it to Ace during a chance encounter at a guitar center on Sunset. Ace's response surprised him. He didn't offer sympathy or shake his head sadly like everyone else did when Frusciante's name came up. Instead, Ace asked for the address. 3 days later, he showed up at Frusciante's door with a Les Paul and an amplifier. What Frusciante saw when he opened that door was not the space ace of Kiss mythology, not the silver makeup and platform boots. This was Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, 50 years old, carrying a guitar case and looking tired but determined. Frusciante, suspicious and defensive, almost closed the door. But Ace said something that stopped him. He did not offer help or preach recovery. He simply said he had heard Frusciante play, that he understood the space between the notes, and that he wanted to show him something about sound that most guitarists never learned. It was an offer of knowledge, not rescue. That made all the difference. The first session lasted 6 hours. They barely spoke about addiction, about Kiss, about the Chili Peppers, about anything personal. Instead, Ace plugged in and began demonstrating what he called spatial playing, the technique that had made his Kiss solos so distinctive. It was not just about the notes you played, Ace explained, but about the architecture of silence around them, the way you could make a guitar sound like it was transmitting from another dimension. Frusciante, despite his condition, despite the fog in his brain, felt something click. This was not blues-based rock, not the Hendrix-inspired approach he had built his career on. This was something else, something atmospheric and eerie and vast. Ace showed him how to use delay and reverb not as effects, but as instruments themselves. How to let notes hang in space and decay naturally, creating an ambient landscape behind the rhythm. He demonstrated the wah-wah pedal techniques he had developed in the 70s, but more importantly, he showed Frusciante how to think about guitar tone as a texture rather than just a sound. These were techniques Ace had developed during his Kiss years, but refined during his solo work, especially during the Frehley's Comet period, when he had more creative control. Now, sitting in this cluttered bungalow with a younger guitarist who was barely holding himself together, Ace was passing on knowledge that he had never formally taught anyone. What happened over the next several months was not a traditional mentorship. Ace did not show up every day or even every week. Sometimes 2 weeks would pass, and Frusciante would wonder if he would see him again. Then Ace would appear, usually in the evening, always with his guitar, and they would play. The sessions had a ritual quality. Ace would set up his amp, tune carefully, and then start with what he called ambient mapping. He would play a simple progression, then show Frusciante how to layer sounds over it, creating dimensional depth. It was like sonic architecture, building rooms and corridors out of reverb and delay. Ace talked about his Kiss years differently than Frusciante had expected. There was no bitterness, no glory stories about arenas and platinum albums. Instead, Ace spoke about the loneliness of being inside that Space Ace character. How the makeup and costume had been both a prison and a liberation. He explained how he had used his guitar playing to maintain his real identity, how every solo was Paul Frehley speaking, through the Space Ace mask. The space rock approach, the cosmic sound effects, the eerie, sustained notes, these were ways of expressing isolation and alienation while standing in front of 100,000 screaming fans. Frusciante understood this immediately. He had felt the same disconnection performing with the Chili Peppers, the same sense of being trapped inside a role while his real self was drowning. The technical lessons were inseparable from the psychological ones. Ace showed Frusciante how to use feedback constructively, letting the guitar resonate until it found natural harmonic frequencies, then controlling those frequencies like you were steering a spacecraft. He demonstrated his signature use of the toggle switch, creating stuttering rhythmic effects that added mechanical, almost alien textures to solos. But more than the techniques themselves, Ace taught an approach to playing that was about creating atmosphere and emotional space. He called it playing from the void. The idea that the most powerful guitar moments came not from technical virtuosity, but from accessing whatever emptiness or pain you carried and translating it directly into sound. By late 1997, something had shifted in Frusciante. He was not clean yet, not by any measure, but he was playing again, really playing in ways he had not since leaving the Chili Peppers. The sessions with Ace had reawakened something, not just his technique, but his understanding of what a guitar could express. He began writing again, fragments at first, then complete pieces. The influence of Ace's spatial approach was everywhere in this new material. Where Frusciante's earlier work had been rooted in funk rock and power chords, these new compositions had ethereal qualities. Sustained notes hanging in reverb washes, delay patterns creating rhythmic ghosts behind the main melodies. Ace noticed the change and started pushing harder, introducing more complex concepts. He brought in a Echoplex delay unit, the same model he had used on the Alive albums, and showed Frusciante how to manipulate tape delay to create unpredictable patterns. They experimented with unconventional tunings, with placing the guitar pickups in different positions, with running the signal through multiple amplifiers to create phase interactions. These were techniques Ace had developed during his wilderness years, the period after leaving Kiss, when he had time to experiment without the pressure of maintaining the Space Ace image. One night, Ace brought a recording, a rough demo he had made in 1983, shortly after leaving Kiss the first time. It was an instrumental track, never officially released, that captured everything he had been trying to teach Frusciante. The guitar sounded like it was calling from deep space, notes bending and sustaining in ways that felt both musical and extraterrestrial. Ace explained that he had recorded it alone, completely sober for one of the first times in years, trying to capture what his guitar playing sounded like when it was just him and the instrument. No band, no character, no audience. It was the purest expression of his musical identity he had ever achieved. Frusciante listened to it 3 times in silence. Then he picked up his own guitar and began playing, letting Ace's spatial approach flow through his fingers, but filtered through his own musical DNA. What came out sounded like nothing either of them had played before. In 1998, the Red Hot Chili Peppers reached out to Frusciante. Anthony Kiedis and Frehley had heard he was playing again, that something had changed. They wanted to try working together, to see if the magic they had captured on Blood Sugar Sex Magik could be reclaimed. Frusciante was terrified. He had not performed sober in years. The persona he had inhabited in the band before felt like someone else's life. But Ace told him something that made the difference. He said that the mask you wear does not have to be a prison. It can be a tool. Space Ace had been a prison for Paul Frehley until he learned to use that character to express things he could not say as himself. Frusciante could do the same thing. He could be the Chili Peppers guitarist again, but this time he could play from the void, bringing all that spatial, cosmic darkness into the funk rock framework. The Californication sessions began in late 1998. Producer Rick Rubin immediately noticed something different in Frusciante's playing. The funk elements were still there, the rhythmic precision that made the Chili Peppers' groove so infectious. But now there were these moments, these passages, where the guitar seemed to float above the rhythm section, creating atmospheric layers that the band had never had before. On tracks like Scar Tissue and Other Side, Frusciante's guitar work had an ambient quality, notes sustained and swimming in reverb, delay patterns creating haunting echoes behind the main melody. The influence of Ace's teaching was obvious to anyone who knew what to listen for, but nobody in the mainstream music press made the connection. How could they? Nobody knew about the sessions, about the 2 guitarists meeting in a Hollywood bungalow, about the space rock lessons passed from one generation to another. Frusciante never publicly acknowledged Ace's role during this period. It was not about secrecy or shame. It was about respect. What they had shared was personal, almost sacred. These were lessons about survival as much as music, about maintaining your identity while fighting the demons that came with talent and fame and the specific hell of addiction. When Californication became a massive hit, selling millions of copies and returning the Chili Peppers to arena headlining status, Frusciante sent Ace a copy with a simple note. He thanked him for showing him the space between the stars. Ace understood exactly what he meant. Over the following years, as Frusciante recorded By the Way and Stadium Arcadium with the Chili Peppers, the spatial approach became more prominent in his playing. Listen to Dosed, or Wet Sand, or Turn It Again, and you can hear Ace Frehley's influence clearly. The way Frusciante uses delay to create rhythmic patterns, the sustained notes that hang like celestial bodies in the mix, the feedback manipulation that adds texture without overwhelming the song. These techniques came directly from those secret sessions in 1997 and 1998. Frusciante had taken what Ace taught him and integrated it into his own musical language, creating something that was neither pure Frehley nor pure Frusciante, but a hybrid that pushed rock guitar into new territory. Ace continued his own journey, releasing solo albums and occasionally reuniting with Kiss for special events. He never talked about the Frusciante sessions either. It was not his style to seek credit or draw attention to his role as an informal mentor. But in 2004, during an interview for a guitar magazine, he was asked about modern players he respected. He mentioned Frusciante specifically, noting the spatial quality in his recent work, the way he seemed to understand that guitar playing was as much about architecture as melody. The interviewer did not pick up on the deeper connection, but people close to both musicians recognized it as Ace's way of acknowledging what had happened between them. Frusciante's later solo work made the Frehley influence even more explicit. Albums like the Empyrean and PBX Funicular Intaglio Zone featured extended ambient guitar passages, cosmic soundscapes built from layered delays and reverbs, experimental approaches to tone that clearly descended from the space rock philosophy Ace had taught him. In interviews about these albums, Frusciante would sometimes mention Ace Frehley among his influences, usually in passing, always with respect. He never detailed the actual sessions, never explained the full extent of what he had learned. But the music spoke for itself. Anyone who knew both guitarists' work could trace the lineage. In 2019, a surprising discovery emerged. A music journalist researching Frusciante's recovery period found references to the Ace sessions in journals that Frusciante had kept during 1997 and 1998. These journals, parts of which Frusciante agreed to let the journalist quote, detailed the lessons in remarkable specificity. Frusciante had written about Ace's toggle switch techniques, about the philosophy of playing from the void, about the idea that the guitar could be a transmission device for emotions too complex or dark to express verbally. He had transcribed some of Ace's explanations about spatial playing, about creating dimensional depth in guitar tone. Reading these entries decades later, the full scope of what happened between the two musicians became clear. Around the same time, audio from one of the sessions surfaced, though neither guitarist confirmed its authenticity. The recording, grainy and lo-fi, captured about 40 minutes of the two playing together. You can hear Ace demonstrating a delay pattern, then Frusciante attempting it, then both of them building an improvised piece using the technique. The chemistry is obvious. Despite coming from completely different musical worlds, despite the age difference, despite everything that separated them culturally and generationally, they spoke the same language when guitars were in their hands. The recording circulated among guitar enthusiasts and collectors, becoming something of a holy grail for fans of both musicians. Neither Frusciante nor Ace has ever discussed the sessions in detail publicly. In 2020, when Frusciante rejoined the Chili Peppers for the third time, a journalist asked him directly about Ace's influence on his playing. Frusciante smiled and said simply that Ace had taught him important things during a difficult period, that he remained grateful, and that some lessons were too personal to reduce to an interview soundbite. Ace, when asked about it in a separate interview, nodded and said, Frusciante was a talented player who understood space, which was high praise in Ace's vocabulary. That was as close as either has come to confirming the full story. What happened between John Frusciante and Ace Frehley in those secret sessions represents something larger than just technical instruction. It was a transmission of knowledge between generations, a passing of wisdom from one guitarist who had survived rock and roll's darkest temptations to another who was in the middle of that same fight. Ace had learned things during his Kiss years and his subsequent struggles that went beyond music theory or guitar technique. He had learned how to maintain your artistic identity inside a commercial machine, how to use your instrument as a lifeline when everything else was falling apart, how to transform pain and isolation into something beautiful and strange. Frusciante received those lessons at exactly the moment when he needed them most. The spatial approach to guitar playing gave him a new musical direction, but more importantly, it gave him a framework for understanding his own experience. The idea of playing from the void, of letting the guitar express the emptiness and alienation you felt. This was not just a technique. It was a survival strategy. It was a way of taking the darkness that threatened to destroy you and channeling it into something that could communicate with other people, that could create connection across that very isolation. The influence of those sessions rippled outward in ways neither guitarist could have predicted. As Frusciante's post-reunion work with the Chili Peppers incorporated more ambient and spatial elements, younger guitarists took notice. The atmospheric approach that had seemed so distinctive to Ace's Kiss work suddenly appeared in a modern context, filtered through Frusciante's alternative rock sensibility. A new generation of players began exploring similar territory, using delay and reverb as compositional tools, thinking about guitar tone as texture and architecture. They were learning from Frusciante, but through him, they were also learning from Ace Frehley, even if they did not realize it. In 2018, Ace Frehley released Spaceman, his most personal solo album. The record featured several instrumental tracks that showcased his spatial playing approach in its purest form, unfiltered by band dynamics or commercial considerations. Critics noted that the album sounded remarkably fresh, despite Ace being in his late 60s, that his guitar work had an experimental quality that felt contemporary. What they did not know was that Frusciante had sent Ace demos of some of his own recent ambient guitar work, instrumental pieces that pushed the space rock approach into new territories. Those recordings had inspired Ace to revisit his own cosmic soundscapes with fresh ears, to remember what had made his playing distinctive in the first place. The musical conversation between the two guitarists had become reciprocal. Ace had taught Frusciante how to access spatial dimensions in his playing, and now Frusciante's explorations of those techniques were feeding back into Ace's work, showing him new possibilities within his own approach. It was a beautiful example of how artistic influence works best when it flows in multiple directions, when the teacher learns from the student as much as the reverse. When Frusciante rejoined the Chili Peppers in 2019 for what would become the Unlimited Love Sessions, he brought all of these influences with him. The resulting albums featured some of his most adventurous guitar work, blending the funk rock foundation of the band with ambient passages, spatial effects, and cosmic textures. On tracks like These Are the Ways and The Heavy Wing, you can hear decades of musical evolution compressed into single guitar performances, from his early Hendrix-inspired work through the Californication era's melodic approach to the full realization of the space rock philosophy Ace had taught him 25 years earlier. The story of John Frusciante and Ace Frehley's secret sessions is a reminder that rock and roll's greatest moments often happen away from the spotlight, in small rooms between musicians who recognize something in each other. It is a story about how knowledge passes between generations, not through formal instruction, but through shared experience, through the simple act of two guitarists sitting together and playing. Most importantly, it is a story about how survival and art intertwine, how the same techniques that help you stay alive can also help you create something that transcends your individual struggle. Today, both guitarists continue their journeys. Ace still records and performs, his legacy secure as one of rock's most distinctive voices. Frusciante remains with the Chili Peppers while pursuing experimental solo work that pushes into increasingly abstract territories. The space rock lessons continue to inform both of their approaches. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in rehearsal spaces and home studios, younger guitarists are discovering similar techniques, creating their own cosmic soundscapes, unknowingly following a path that Ace Frehley first mapped in the 1970s and taught to John Frusciante in 1997. The space between the stars keeps expanding, and the transmission continues.